Okay, good afternoon, everybody. This is Anto Budiarcho, and this is Monday Live. This is something that we do every Monday afternoon at 3 p.m. to try and figure out the advances in smart buildings and just see where the built environment is headed. Some interesting comments there from Roger. I'm sure he's going to bring it up again. The panelists are listed on mondaylive.org, just in case you wonder who we are. A reminder that the views expressed here are personal, not of any company or organization. And please do post questions and comments on the Zoom chat so that we can have a two-way dialogue. If you need any of the links or any of the slides that we have on this slide deck that I'm showing, it is also on mondaylive.org, so you can head over there. So in September, for the past few weeks, we've been talking about what we're calling the Great Convergence, just a lot of different technologies and concepts coming together. I'm going to continue that one last time today. Our agenda, our normal news and trends, chit chat, and then the Great Convergence. And we had a really interesting conversation last week on APIs. We thought that it was so interesting that we're going to dig a little deeper and specifically try and sort of understand APIs in the context of the smarter stack. So I think that's going to be really interesting for a discussion. But before doing that, I'm going to hand it over to Ken. What's going on, Ken?
We've got our new issue online, and to everyone's surprise, mostly mine, it seems like it's working. The idea of moving from a monthly model to a post when you feel like it model is working well. We've got some good, interesting posts. Just basically trying to context what we do. I think the bigger thing is to try and find it on the on social media. And so I've written a little bit of an article there just talking about that, contextualizing our online presence wherever. And someone asked the question, is the reinvention of automated buildings, is it to be the social media for the industry? And no, it's not social media, but I think what it is a context map of our vast industry online presence depicted by each of our communities of practice. Correctly contexted by our authors. So I think that's what we're seeing is we're digging deep into this online environment. It was great what Roger was talking about there before we started. It's interesting how far do we get in, because we easily get lost in it, but we also can get found in it too. So I think we need to try and find the right balance. But just as a service to our industry, what I'm seeing is that more and more we're all having all kinds of online events. And so for our sponsors, having a vehicle, and for our contributing editors as well, having a vehicle where they can daily explain what's going on and even just link to stuff that they were involved with, I think is an important piece. So I'm kind of seeing that maybe the reinvention, one never knows when reinvention starts or when it finishes. I think it's just a process that we fall into, and our continual reinvention. I think we're going to see that the site will kind of shift towards try to help you find stuff in social media. And it's not just social media, it's actual events that you're going to. They're being sponsored by all kinds of new identities we don't even know about. So when you roll your eyes back and try and figure out how would I find that, to me, the commonality is our resource of automated buildings. You go there and then we try to give you context as to what direction to go. It's early stages. We're not sure what we're doing as always, but I think rather than the fact it's just not just me doing it, we've got a great number of people now contributing and sharing with us their insight. I think that's going to be useful. Anyway, so we see ourselves as really the library and the landing and launch pad for the industry, I think. And we see that we're trying to make anything you post on automated buildings, very easy to share with social media. And then also we see folks very much leaning on social media to populate their articles in interviews. I think we're seeing a trend that the length of an article and an interview will actually drop. And more what will be happening is the media sponsors and the contributing editors are going to be more just providing links to what's happening out there, which I think is a useful service. Of interest, when we started 23 years ago, what we were doing back in those days was providing links to websites. It was the .com days, and I see this as the dot the .online days, or the .social media, or the megaverse days, and we have to try and figure out together how we're going to navigate this new identity. Back to you, Anto.
Thank you, Ken. And Ken and I have had some conversations about how to leverage this new site and Monday Live. You see there on the screen, Ken posted an episode on Monday Live, which is good, which is great, but maybe we can do other things beyond just having a post of the fact that Monday Live has happened. Exactly how, I think we need to experiment and explore that. And I just wanted to bring that up. Great stuff, Ken.
Thanks.
And Mark.
Okay, I got a couple things to share. So I want to play Did You Know or Do You Know? So it's some interesting statistics that I put together for a presentation last week. And again, we're kind of looking at our marketplace, and it's projected, you know, everybody's a little bit different. There's several of these industry analysts projections that are out there. So I just selected one, which roughly we're looking at about a little over 11% CAGR growth through 2031. So I think, you know, the future is bright for all of us. One that's disturbing to me is that generally the overall connectivity penetration rate across all building systems is only around 16%. So that gives us, you know, one thing, why is it so low? But just as important is, again, another opportunity. Again, 21% of the buildings at most have digital HVAC controls. No surprise here, the number of collaborative spaces has nearly doubled since we encountered the pandemic. This one was extremely interesting, that the space per office employee, the square footage, is at a 22-year low, roughly about 152 square feet per employee. So again, I think I personally attribute that to more open, more collaborative spaces and so forth and so on. And then, as you know, we are continuing to operate in this hybrid model, that being in the office, Tuesday and Wednesdays are the busiest days. Friday is the least. And again, I don't think that's too surprising for many of us on the call today. And one last reminder, Haystack Connect, our webinar series is continuing Wednesday, September 28th. From 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can go register for free if you're not already registered at haystackconnect.org. And some of the content and presentations that will be made is extending Haystack to digital twins and the industrial metaverse, which I think will be an interesting to hear what John Burton will be presenting that, well, he has to say. Making integration a plug and play proposition. That's Anto is presenting. Oh, yes, I forgot you're doing it that day. Also, digital twinning, AI enablement, and interoperable smart heating systems. And this is Nicholas Wren, who's CEO and digital twin specialist. So again, Wednesday, September 28th, 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Eastern. Hope you can join us. Back to you, Anto.
Mark, just going back to your previous slide, a couple of things on that. I mean, surely if only 21% of buildings have some intelligence, it's not surprising that only 16% of buildings are connected, huh? Because they got, what else do they connect into?
Yeah, no, exactly. But
Yeah.
you know, again, it's interesting is that there's lots of opportunity, and we as an industry have been talking for years about how do we get our technologies, our solutions into smaller footprint buildings.
Yeah.
And again, are we there yet? I think we're making progress, but we're not completely there yet.
Yeah. But the other comment I was going to make is that what's a little bit scary, of course, is about your in the office. I think pretty much it's coming down to 3 days in the office and 2 days off. What that means is that 4 days a week, which is the majority of the week, the office is potentially empty.
Yeah.
You know,
That's
a scary thought. You know, that only 3 days a week out of 7 is it being used. The potential.
very scary.
It is. And, you know, for our industry, again, that means, as I see it, we have to be able to operate in truly real time and active, what I call active occupancy management. Again, based on those days where you have more people and based on the numbers and so forth and so on. So I think that's something that, you know, we need to continue to look at as an industry and move that forward as well.
And I think it's, you know, it's likely, Karen, I saw that the Apple staff are really upset because they said, yes, you can do 3 and 2 days, but the 2 days have got to be split by a working day. And they're kind of all up in arms saying, no, we want the 2 days together. So I want my Monday and Friday, or my, you know, my Thursday and Friday or something. So they're actually, you know, sort of raising it with Apple themselves, because Apple try to resolve it. I guess it's the same as saying, yeah, you can do 3 days, but one of those has to be Monday or Friday or something. But I don't know. I don't know, because clearly the office is always going to be full on Wednesday, and you know, Monday and Friday are going to be pretty much ghost towns.
But when you think about it, though, Roger, from our perspective, people who provide systems in those buildings and stuff, I'm kind of struggling with, does it really matter to us? Because the days when the buildings are full, all our systems are supposed to be running and doing their job, right? So it's not like, you know, the systems are still going to have to do what they're going to do when the buildings are full on them, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, whatever. It's just when the days aren't. So to Mark's point, I think there's a lot more opportunity of changing, tuning, updating, you know, monitoring the systems in the context of the occupancy perspective. But
Yeah,
by and large,
I kind of get that. I kind of get that. And but if I owned the building, I'd be kind of worried about it.
You're screwed.
I mean, I mean, what you're saying, you know, hotels have been doing for years, you know, about the occupancy. It's
exactly
the same sort of principle, but it's just if I was an owner of a building or an occupant, I'd be a little bit worried about the fact that I'm paying this huge lease and it's empty 4 days a week.
Right.
Well, again, you know, I think we've seen it. There was a building in Charlotte by a healthcare company. They built a brand new building. I think it was called, the healthcare provider was Centene or somebody, one that I didn't recognize. And they spent God knows how much money to build a brand new building, latest state of the art. Then after it's ready and they're getting ready, they were ready to move in, the company decided everybody can work remote. So they're not moving in, and they've got a whole new building now that they're trying to sell. They
Wow.
decided not to go in.
Yeah.
But to me, the most worrying thing is having an asset that's only being used for basically a minority of the time,
Yeah.
right, is not sustainable.
No.
Right. Somebody, I think Sean just mentioned mixed use. We heard a lot of that about mixed use at Realcomm, and sort of generally that's obviously it's got to be the trend here. And I'm sure that opens up different kinds of opportunities for technology and systems. And, you know, we have only 16%, 21% of buildings with anything, so the opportunity is clearly there, and I'm surprised at that 16 and 21% number. I thought it was actually lower than that, but
it doesn't. But I think that was the point I was trying to make, Anto. There's the mix, the change in the use of the building is going to require better, clever, smarter technologies and stuff for the building owners. Because, you know, if I was the building owner, to Roger's point, I would, if this is the case, I would kick everybody out on Monday and Friday and turn it off, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that'd be the best energy savings ever.
okay.
Can we
Right,
quote you on that, Anno? Can we quote you? Anno says, we're kicking your asses out on Mondays and Fridays. Get out of my building.
Turning them off.
You can tell all that old stuff. Yeah, you can tell all that old stuff. They're out. They get out.
Any other thoughts? Roger, you were talking about the Dubai event.
Yeah, I was saying, just relaying the thoughts. So, and there's two aspects to it. So it was presented at a conference at the Burj Khalifa in Dubai last week. And it was in the evening, Friday evening. And they had about sort of 300 attendees in at the conference. But they actually streamed it on Facebook and all sorts of other social media, and it actually peaked at 83,500 people. They did a little bit of it last year, just as word of warning, and they had, you know, similar sort of people attend, and they got up to 3,500. But they had a whole chunk where it was silenced because they actually put some music on, and Warner Brothers recognized it, and they hadn't licensed it to play it. So they were blacked out for a period during that. So be careful when you're doing that and be sure of what your content is. But I was just staggered. You know, as I say, obviously they were watching the garden down, and it peaked out at 83,500, which is amazing sort of thing, which you won't, you know, I've never had any conference or anything I've ever been to where you've got that sort of attendance.
Do you have information as to where they were from? Geographically, at least?
They're assessing that now. And certainly the emails I got were from all over Europe as well as in just the Middle East. So when they kind of get that sort of information, I'll feed it back to you. But I think they're kind of analyzing it at the moment. I'm assuming they must be able to do that from, you know, IP addresses and everything else.
Yeah.
It was because of you, Roger.
You're probably right, but I didn't want to say that, Mark.
All right. Any other thoughts? Any other?
Just to close around to the kicking people out of the building. To be clear, in Singapore, the government buildings, we did a lot of project work in government buildings. At lunchtime, between 12 o'clock and 1:30, you are mandated to take your lunch, and they will turn the AC off and the lights off at 12:30 to 1. Now, turning the air conditioning off in Singapore is a big deal. It gets hot in there pretty fast. And yeah, so they're a lot more aggressive, but that was the government building. So
yeah, you can only do that in Singapore.
Or China.
Okay, let us move on. So the Great Convergence. So we talked about APIs last week, and we had our planning call after. And one of the things we sort of realized is that we talked about APIs as the standard, but we didn't really talk about what APIs are all about. And so there were sort of different views and sort of understanding of APIs. So we thought it would be sort of an interesting to sort of think about the history or sort of the breadth of APIs, how APIs get used. So I put this together. It's a little rough, but there you go. Believe it or not, the concept of APIs started somewhere in the 40s and 50s. It was mentioned in several papers in the 40s, and the first ever reference, you actually see it here, is in the 50s in a computer that looks more like a museum. I think that's kind of interesting in its own right. I thought it was much later than that. It started to take off in the 70s with the companies like Univac or computers like, is it companies or it's a company, right? Univac is the company. So that's when it started going into these sort of mini computers of those days. When the desktop came along, and specifically Windows, Windows had APIs all over the place. That's how you program with them. If you were to create an application, you'd be calling APIs all the time. And in fact, my first experience with APIs is a product called the CDC Engine, which I created in 1990. Actually didn't have a UI. That's why it's called the CDC Engine, and all it was a whole bunch of APIs, Windows APIs back then. So that's kind of interesting. But the sort of the modern day APIs really started to come in the 2000s, especially with this thing called the REST API, representative state transfer. And some of you may remember OBIX. OBIX was actually the first initiative within the building space trying to use REST APIs back in 2003, 4, 5-ish. But now when we talk about APIs, and I think a lot of the conversation last week was really this is kind of the view of API today. It's really to do with the cloud, to do with the internet, and how to bring everything together, right? But that doesn't make all of the previous APIs go away, because they're still there. Right, so there's sort of this long history of APIs, and they also happen in different places. Obviously, today is the cloud and the web, but APIs is how the internals of hardware can often talk with each other. It goes into operating systems, and obviously it's in buildings, as we know. And platforms like Niagara and Metasys and others, I'm sure, have a lot of APIs inside them. So there's a sort of vast diversity of APIs that we kind of need to keep in mind. And any comments from anyone on this?
Yeah, just quickly, I think, and you'll get to it, Anto, and I think the focus for last week too was, are you building a product that has API centric from the beginning, or are they bolt-ons? It's kind of fascinating to see the 40s and the 50s. That was really API centric in some ways, and they were thinking about doing it as part of the core product. Versus we kind of, if you look through that timeline, we kind of morphed away from it and have come back to that perspective.
Yeah, and that was the reason I brought up the CDC Engine that I did, because that was API. That was all API. There's nothing but APIs.
Right.
Okay, so moving on, the question that we want to discuss is, where does APIs fit on the smarter stack? All right, this is the smarter stack. Normally we put, applications and different types of data on this, but where do APIs fit? And we think the answer is in between all of the different layers, right? It's basically all the gaps between the layers. Those are interfaces, and the I of API is interface, right? So that's really where APIs come in. APIs also come in sort of horizontally, sideways. If you think of an app needing to talk to another app, then that will be an API sort of going that way. So the way Tracy sort of put it on our planning call, this is the grout of the smarter stack, right? It's the glue, is the grout of the smarter stack. But wait a minute. By the way, I couldn't justify putting APIs in the physical layer, but I'm sure somebody is going to come up with a reason why we should. But anyway, but this sort of draws a picture that all of the APIs are the same, and we know that's not the case. Right. So in reality, it's probably more like this. I'm just using different colors to depict different types of APIs, whatever they are. And on the horizontal side, it'll all, again, there's a similar sort of thing going on. right? So they're all very different because they're trying to provide different types of interfaces between different types of things. But we know even this is too simplistic of a story, because we all like to innovate and we all like to do different things. And in reality, it's probably more like this, or even more confusing, right? Because on one particular layer or one particular interface between two layers, there's going to be different companies or different standards or different initiatives doing different things. And so how does this all work? Well, the smarter stack is all about the layers. And the layers are, I think the easiest way to think about it is the layers are really services, right? So if you take this first one here, an app is really a service, it's doing something, and it's extracting information out of the underneath the exchange layer and from the data and the systems consequently from them, using APIs. So this bottom arrow is the API, and there's an API going to the top. Maybe that's a web HTML kind of API or something, and all of the different services are basically similarly sort of structured like this. It's in other words, smarter stack cannot work without APIs. So I'm going to stop and open up. I'm going to leave this up here and open up the conversation.
I think just from a couple of perspectives on my side, 100% agree with the take that you've got on it, that it's not only, you know, left and right, up and down, it's different types, and everyone's got different versions and stuff. I think the other one is, and again, back to my earlier point, you could also draw another picture here, right, where someone's got an application from purpose through to physical with no APIs in between that whole thing. That's how they built the product, right? And in fact, there are, you know, back to my earlier point, there are companies now who build products with this picture in mind. In other words, with every layer that they've got in their software development, they themselves build their own APIs, or have their own internal APIs, which they themselves consume, right? So, but that's where the current technologies of building products, you know, they will, and there's so many services around available, you know, simple things like Kafka buses, right? That you could just have an API to the Kafka bus, and someone else in the development piece will pick up the message, you know, somewhere else down the line using that interface. Versus the old days, I just sent you a message, you know, based on some proprietary structure, and there's no interface per se. So there is a model where older products have no internal APIs, but only, you know, Windows is a good example. So Windows 3.1 was a pretty monolithic application from bottom to top, but it had APIs that allowed you to come in at it from the sides, if you will, not in between the layers. So back to your point, this is a lot more modern approach, both in what makes sense, but also even just pure software development, which was kind of my mantra last week, that the tools to build products based on this type of approach is a lot more mature, prolific, easy to use, quick to get going. You wouldn't even think about building a product these days without some sort of Kafka bus or messaging bus, you know, as part of the product.
So, Anto, I think what you've done here is terrific in terms of describing the environment, and unfortunately, it speaks to the complication, the complexity. Maybe that's a better word to use. But you know, I think for discussions purposes, this is really helpful. But it almost you know, it almost makes BACnet sound easy, right? Which is pretty hard to do, and yet because BACnet's so well defined in writing, you know, and as a document that everybody can look at, read, and then develop products against, and then have them tested against. To try to do the same thing in the world of APIs, you can see why this is not going to happen. Just there's so much momentum in the software industry as a whole now around as Anno has been pointing out, around the use of API technology in any kind of software development effort. So everybody's doing their own version of it, of how they're using the raw technology to write software. So how do you go from that world to our world of trying to put define or show where APIs fit into the smarter stack? Not easy.
One of the things that jumped out to me thinking about last week's conversation is that, you know, I can imagine, you know, your national sales guy getting excited, saying, yeah, we've got the $1 million order, they have APIs and we have APIs, they have
That's right.
APIs, and we're all good, right? Until you realize that their APIs is that brown one here and your APIs is that green one here. And
Right.
you know, so the difference in APIs themselves, which goes to your point there, Steve, of the complexity.
Yeah.
And I think that's the crucial message here, Anto, that I was trying to focus on last week too, is that we bandied the word API. And I think this drawing does a great perspective on, whoa, they're all over the place and they're all different colors and they're all different types. I don't even know if I'm speaking about the same thing at the same level, but to your point, the national sales account guy goes, yeah, they said they have an API, so we should be good. Oh, really? You know,
Right.
Forget about standards. I mean,
No, and I think that's part of the problem is people confuse APIs with a standard. And it is not. API is a tool, just like I have a box full of tools in my garage and you use different ones for different purposes, right? So it's APIs does not equal interoperability. I think we established that last week. And I think part of the problem is the term API has become so generically applied to anything that allows two different things to interface that, you know, on one hand, it sounds like the magic glue and the standard to make it easy to program with anything. But on the other hand, it does not solve the problem of, you know, bottom to top stack interoperability with data in particular.
It
Right,
doesn't
so-
define interoperability, but it enables it.
Well,
Because-
yeah, maybe, but I would argue that it enables integration more than interoperability.
Right.
Right.
In fact,
Unless, I
it-
mean, if you, I would point to things like Haystack and protocols and, you know, contextual kinds of definitions that go more towards interoperability than just the API part of it. API is one piece of that, but it takes
would you
more
say-
for interoperability.
Tracy, to Scott's message, a comment on the chat about, you know, as a result, standards tend to come out from this jumble of stuff, right? So, you know, if everyone, pick a number, certain percentage of people start using you know, metadata tagging type concepts, then something like a Haystack tends to emerge because, you know, a couple of folks got together and said this makes sense. So, you know, standards or de facto standards tend to emerge out of this mess of stuff because people start saying, oh, you know, so in some contexts, a REST or a JSON API is one of those quote unquote pseudo standards, right? So that's the next level. You say, I've got an API, and the next question they go, oh, is it JSON REST based, you know, API? Yep, absolutely. Okay, I pass the next gate. That just says it's, you know, brown color versus green color, or, you know, something like that.
Don't forget the
Yeah,
maintenance. Don't forget the maintenance of that as well, Anna. When anyone changes
Yeah.
something either side of the line, guess what happens? You know, you got to maintain this stuff continually.
If Jim were here, he'd be reminding us that it's
He is
not
here.
scalable. Oh, sorry, it's off my screen. Sorry, Jim. I'm speaking for you. It's not scalable, and I would almost say APIs are more of a standard technique for integration. I mean, it gives the syntax in which to exchange stuff, but it does nothing to standardize the stuff that you're exchanging.
No, but it's,
that's
if
where-
if you look at Haystack, one of the first things that they did was to create an API, the REST API for Haystack. All right. And
Right.
you can, basically that's that green line here, probably between
Yeah.
the exchange and data, somewhere around there.
They add another whole layer to it, and that's what I was just going to say. You know, if you tear apart pretty much any standard, you'll see there are multiple aspects to every standard, right? And the exchange mechanism is part of it, but the contextual stuff that wraps around and describes what you're exchanging is probably what makes it more of a standard almost than anything, right?
Yes.
So Mahmood commented right at the outset of this conversation that exchange would be the answer for where APIs live. And I think it would be good if we talk that out, because when I read under exchange, it says what makes it work together. And when you think of what an API does generically, it allows one or multiple things to work together. So there's an argument to be made that instead of this complex drawing that you have here, is that that's where APIs live, and that for a given API, you've got to then describe it, but you're describing it within the context of it. It's a piece of smarts within the exchange layer. What do you guys think?
I think that's
I
too
think part
limiting.
of the, yeah, I was going to say part of the problem is all of these answers are right. I agree with what you just said, Steve.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I guess
Yeah.
where I'm coming from is to try to, it's always helpful when you're to keep things simple if you can, because we're trying to get people to adopt the smarter stack, to understand the smarter stack. And if we get overly complex the way the current illustration appears, then I don't necessarily help. I don't think it's contrary to what we're trying to do with the smarter stack in general. So that's why I'm arguing maybe Mahmood's got it right, is that's where the API as a technology, as a smarts technology should live.
yeah,
I struggle with that though, Steve, because especially in our space, the type of things that get asked of me or what I ask of others is it tends to be anywhere in this process. In fact, so oftentimes it's more convenience, right? So, my guys would say, well, rather than getting access to the raw data, what I'd really like is the output of your apps, right? And get the results of your apps into my platform, which is more at the delivery / apps layer. And so the moment you open that question, it kind of assumes, well, maybe I wanted at any layer. Now that, to your point, maybe we've gone a little way overboard on this as a result, and we've made it worse rather than better.
Yeah, I guess where I am with that, Anno, is I don't necessarily think just because there's a vertical relationship with Exchange underneath apps that precludes an API from delivering information. I just think you have to stack it somehow. And so the idea that it's at the Exchange layer doesn't mean it can't be data to apps or data to delivery or apps to delivery and so on. I think it's just the mechanism that allows for exchanging of data irrespective of where it has to go in the stack.
Yeah, and I kind of second what Steve saying there, because if I was looking at the delivery and was saying, okay, in there it's an MSI, you could color in a lots of boxes there too of where it crosses over. So it could be that each item you fill in here could actually have effects on others, but for want of putting it in a home, that kind of makes sense to say, yes, it is Exchange.
Well, and the other part that I came across just a couple of weeks ago talking with a potential partner, it was interesting to me that, same thing. They said they had APIs, and then we did a bit of a deep dive, and they said, and they were talking about APIs down at the Exchange data layer. And then a guy said, well, how about some of the stuff that you've got at the higher level? They go, well, we've got APIs, but we don't publish that. We don't give access to that one. And I went, oh, okay, interesting. The fact that you've used it internally within your structure and your architecture, but you haven't made it available, was an interesting. And I think, to Jim's point, when I prodded on them, their response was, if we expose them, we have to maintain them, right? And so, it was kind of echoing Jim's thoughts at that time.
I guess we're
the angle
sorry.
the angle that I would comment on this is that one of the ways to think about the smarter stack is to enable composability, right? So you can have different systems on different data. So every layer is could be different for different applications and different buildings. And so the lines between them is really how you compose, right? It's kind of the interfaces between the different functions that are represented by the layers. I obviously would agree that Exchange is probably where there are more APIs than anything else, but I don't think it's a black and white that's always there or it's always just in the lines. I think it's a mix.
But if you
I'm looking
compare
at
it
this.
with something like cybersecurity, where would you park that when it really reaches across all of them?
Yeah, it's an overlay really to all of this, right? Cybersecurity.
And I'm looking
The-
at all the colors, and well done, Anto. Is the first thing after I looked at it for a minute, I immediately thought of Rubik's Cube. And I don't know, it's just like turning it and you get the red. Oh, all my APIs are working, or I've got all the APIs to Exchange, Connect, or whatever, all the red squares in a Rubik's Cube, yellow, green, and white, and so forth and so on. And to me is, when I look at that visually, at least for me, you know you've accomplished the API integration interoperability when you've solved Rubik's Cube.
I love that analogy actually, because as in real life, if you're dependent on APIs throughout your whole structure, the second you turn one part of it, things start to break.
Right. Right.
Yeah. You know, the thing to remember too, I mean, if you look at Backnet or LawnWorks or anything like that, and you apply it against, you know, the original 7-layer OSI model, in those protocols, in those stacks that make up protocol, you will find elements that are dealt with throughout most of those layers. You know, LawnWorks goes kind of top to bottom, Backnet's most of the way in there. And then, you know, organizations like BMA or Lawnmark Association have applied other layers on top of that to sort of round out the completeness, so you can go top to bottom and bottom to top in a standard way. So APIs is just one technique within programming that allows some of this stuff to happen, right? There are LawnWorks apps that implement and allow you to integrate and are used with lawn products that have nothing to do with the protocol stack and that piece of it, but there are APIs in the software for sure, right? So now they're starting to pull out of this with things like web services and so forth that get to a much more standardized way of looking at things. But
So
I was going to call on Jim because on the planning call last week, he was sort of commenting on the sort of the commercial sort of aspects of this, of the layering and of the role of APIs. Can you opine to that, Jim?
I'm in the car in a sort of bad zone, so I apologize for no picture. But you know, the question of how this fits out commercially is really not clear, because you know, a lot of people have historical products that have made different decisions here over the years, and other people you know, have newer products. So to me, it's actually not clear how it's going to come out commercially, Anto.
So let me make a suggestion, guys. So by putting it, number of people on the call may, besides us as panelists, the participants may also be aware of some of the parallel work we're doing with the Coalition for Smarter Buildings, where we're trying to specify interoperability for use by the industry. And I'm arguing that by putting APIs in the Exchange layer, one of the objectives we could have in the specification process is to define characteristics of APIs that will make them more usable or interoperable, if you will, for the industry. So for example, an API should be publicly supported, as an example. It should be well documented. It should support multiple communication media. So so go in that direction where we start to define what a good API would look like. And there's going to be different. I think Anno, you would agree that it's going to be different classes of APIs,
Right.
depending where they have to live. But there certainly can be some commonality, some common characteristics that we can ascribe to APIs that, if done by industry participants, will make everybody's life easier.
I love that approach, Steve. I think that is a much better approach than trying to specify the details of it. Because to your point, I've seen really good APIs REST, and I've seen really crappy APIs on REST, right?
Exactly.
And there are, and we can absolutely glean from the industry at getting some guidance on. And then with that, of course, you can also overlay the security requirements on those APIs.
Exactly, because that would be one of the characteristics of a good API, is that it has authorization inherent in it, right? It knows how to authorize users and or systems or whatever needs access to it.
I'd like to see too, with what you're saying, right? Well, here's the structure. The other thing is, I'd like to see people to say, using this diagram, not as colorful as it is, Anto, not that it's great colors, thank you very much, but great work. But for some way for people to, if I was to approach a partner, I'd love to give them this document and go, okay, show me where all your APIs live, right? And say, I can see myself using this as a streamlined bit of a doc to say, show me where all your APIs live, tell me what your standards are. And to your point, I'd love to have here's our standard API guidelines. And to your point, I don't, whether it's this piece of data or that piece of data, or it's used for this or used for that, but there's specific guidelines I'd like for you to follow to make it compatible with INO2. And then I give it to my engineer, and then he go, okay, I get it, lives there, I use these standards. That's, that's a half-hour job, or that's a 6-month job.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
I had a lot of fun with the colors, by the way, over the weekend.
Yeah. It's really nice the way that you've done that. It really tells a story, actually. So good work.
Yeah, now that I've seen this, I think I definitely could use this as a tool to help as I deal with partners, to help identify in reality because oddly enough, it forces you to be in a bucket, right? It forces you can't be fuzzy about where your API lives. It's here or it's not here, right? Or if you say, well, it's sort of in the data layer, but it's not up here, it's not down there, I don't know what that means. You'll have to explain that a bit more for me.
Yeah, Mahmoud's comment on chat, I think, is interesting. It's this looks complex, but I think what he's saying is that there is, if we figure out how we can manage this, then that complexity can be of benefit if we standardize not on the specific APIs, but standardize in the how.
Right.
We manage.
And some of that is actually happening just by the nature of development. And Anno, you were talking about this the other day, where now if somebody comes to you and asks for an API for this or that, your tools just spit it out, basically, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And it's really a very short exercise, and it comes with a page full of JSON code along with it. And, they can just drop that into their code. So the fact that we're all using a limited number of tools is starting to narrow the diversity and number of APIs to a certain degree, at least. I suspect that will continue. That's how de facto standards often get made, right? Who's got the best tool or solve the problem the best. So We'll see.
Right, and back to Steve's point, and even Mahmoud's gone here. Now you can also differentiate between those who did use proper tools to do that, or those who just did a homebrew exercise and threw it together at the last moment. Because now I've got a template that I can use to go, yeah, I see what you got, but it's not quite up to snuff, right? You need to put some more effort into the thing.
The most common usage of it, obviously, today tends to be the cloud. It's interesting. There's an MSI here called OneSite Solutions who've developed something called something OSS Easy API, and they kind of call it as it's built around Niagara. They're saying, that's an integration tool for the industry, but it says, what about when you have to get stuff from outside of the building services background?
Right.
So they're kind of inferring, well, this is what you've got to do to get into IT companies as opposed to the OT bit. So you're sort of integrating with SAP or something else.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we got to be able to talk to the enterprise IT world in addition to the OT suppliers, for sure.
In fact, my Mark was mentioning the Haystack Connect session on Wednesday that I'm speaking at. It's actually to do with this sort of whole area about how to manage different types of systems, not just in buildings but outside of buildings, and how to bring them all together.
So,
Although
since we've been talking about let's just call it the technical aspect of APIs, what about the business side of APIs? So we have this standard, assume eventually we have it, and hopefully people will engage with that standard and develop their respective APIs utilizing that standard. Then ultimately, who owns the API? Is it the group that developed it, the company that developed it? And then what about responsibility for that? In other words, is it IP, et cetera? So what's y'all's thinking about the business side of APIs?
when you say IP, you're talking about intellectual property or internet?
Yeah. I have a hard time saying that word, so I use IP. So there you go.
But I guess, Mark, if they're supplying some sort of package to multiple customers, the responsibility of keeping up to date is with them, and becomes as part of the package. I mean, and most people would be taking it as a SaaS solution, so they don't actually take ownership of it. They're paying for it as a service.
Mm-hmm.
But it's an interface in some ways, not unlike a user interface, right? APIs go between applications and applications, and UIs go between an application and a human being, right? So I only raise that because you're sort of wondering about the commercial side of it. We understand the commercial side of UI. I create a UI, you consume it. Why is it any different to that from a commercial perspective?
Well, there are licenses you pay for a product to use it as a user, right? So that inherently that implies ownership and stuff. So Mark's question is kind of valid. Who owns the licenses, as well? That's a good question, Mark. I think there is both sides of the equation too, because if I built an API and you built an API, and we're trying to mash the two together, then do I need an Anto with a Paddy to come in between, and because I can't be bothered doing it. Is another approach to it, right? Because you could see this is where translation services plug in as well, where there are two different APIs, and I need some third party to come and do it to me because it's cheaper for me to do that than to build it myself, which is like the MuleSoft guys kind of stepped in and did.
I mean, it's the next idea of a gateway, right? The API gateway, essentially.
Yeah.
You can see that.
Yeah, I would just, while we're on that list of things that I'd add into the documentation of, what a good API is, Steve, I'd also include diagnostic services too, right? How do I test it, and how do I make sure it's got you know, it's working. When it stops working, how do I test your end?
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
to do that automatically, so it's not just
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
diagnostic, it's
Yeah.
auditing
Yeah.
and a whole bunch of other
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah, it should have automated error checking and, communication failure reporting. There's a lot of characteristics we can ascribe to these things. We know
Yeah.
enough
No,
to, I think we know enough to take a really good first cut at it, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I really like that idea. It's awesome.
Jim, you got your camera working. Do you wanting to chime in?
No, I just came to a resting spot. Very interesting conversation. Nothing to add right now, Anto. Good.
No. Okay, thank you. So, Gina, I'm going to pick on you because towards the end of the show, I pick on those who said the least. Give us your sort of wrap up of what we've been discussing here. And
so I can only give you an observation.
Okay.
And I'm and I really honestly wanted to hear what everyone had to say about this, because sometimes it's what's not said that is, I guess, most telling. And I think it appears with the amount of APIs that are coming at us, it's going to be another thing that we have to manage. And I think that we don't know how to do it yet. I think in our last session, we talked a little bit about some of the problems of that, what happens when API changes, who's responsible for that, how do you get notice of that? Sometimes you don't know till the customer calls you screaming about something. But APIs, from this conversation, it was really great overview and backstory on how they came to be. I just don't know where they're going to go. That's the most interesting thing, and how much relevance. The other thing about APIs that I found is that, especially when you're dealing with the IoT, is that a lot of them, they have the information, cloud-based information, their application, their database, their GUI, whatever you want, but they're also unwilling to share that with you because they get a lot of that data in their GUI or in their user interface. And it's one of the issues that we've kind of found with companies, trying to say, well, hey, can we integrate? Can we use the API to get your data? And they don't want to. So on one hand, API is easy and another way to get information and data. On the other hand, it presents problems that we have yet to have a solution for. It allows the end customer a lot more alternatives as far as products. But then you also will have, and I see this coming back in 2010, where you've got all these different databases and different user interfaces, and a customer that is saying, it's too much, I need it in one central place. And then you've got other companies that may be a little bit reluctant because you tread on their feet by accessing their data. So that's kind of like, I listened to you guys kind of seeing, what do you think? And I think overall, everyone thinks it's a wonderful idea. And I think, of course, that is. But it also opens the door for a lot more, I think, issues and problems, in my opinion.
Well,
So I don't know if that,
it's a wonderful thing about innovation is you fix one problem and then it uncovers a whole bunch of things that you have to do.
well, that's a good way to sum that up, Anto. So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, when you've got, personally for me, like I have, when you talk about the smart home, you have your videos and you have your video surveillance and you have your lighting and all that stuff at your house. I can have all that in my house, but because they're on, different applications, I only use one or two, and I really don't have a system right now where I can bring that into one user interface. So I don't want to have to open up 10 different applications for things. So API, being able to have something that works and seamlessly works as an end user where I don't have to manage and monitor it if it breaks is incredibly important. And I just don't know I don't know as an industry, I just foresee maybe some issues with how we use that in our industry and how we manage it in our industry. I don't know. I mean, that's just my take on it. I mean, we're talking about it, we like it, but I think underneath all that, we don't know exactly where this is going to go.
I think what you're sort of alluding to is that the natural desire of many companies in this industry to be proprietary, to lock things down.
Yeah.
Right. Can this be used? Can this kind of approach be weaponized in that manner, which will be a terrible thing? So
true. I mean, there's some parallels there with what we've have always fought in our industry, and I think APIs, there's some parallels, good and bad. But Tracy, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say it's already happening, right?
Yeah.
It's an easy way to add a dash of proprietary and sprinkle it in throughout your application if you want.
I guess, guys, that's why I'm suggesting that we move in the direction of making this part of how we define the C4SB standards and framework, and create those guidelines, and then you can present it to any supplier. How do you stack up against this? And now it becomes a measuring stick that everybody can work against.
So with that, we're well past the top of the hour. This has been great conversation again on APIs. And next month is next week is a new month. We haven't totally decided what the theme will be. We'll announce that next month. So with that, wishing you all a great week, and thank you for this conversation on the comments, and the video will be up tomorrow-ish, and so long. Bye.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
See ya.
Right.